Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, OSHA Top 10 Citation List. I have a few notes to go over before we get started. Everyone is in listen-only mode. That means you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have a question at any time during this presentation, please type it in the question box, excuse me, and we will answer all of your questions at the end of our presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Kevin O'Shea, Director of Safety and Training with AGF Access Group, Inc. We will now begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning. This is a regular OSHA list that we see annually, and it's an important list, the top 10 list, because it does a number of things, not least of which obviously makes employers aware of where accidents are occurring or where potential accidents are occurring. And the second part is, and probably just as important, is that the list will be the bones of a number of OSHA approaches in the year, say through emphasis campaigns or national stand-downs. So the list of accidents and fatalities coupled with the list of citations kind of tells you where they're going, and it kind of tells you where their emphasis is going to be. But it's also very useful for employers because it kind of also points and highlights to some of the major issues that you might face in the construction environment. And so the top 10 list for 2019, number one, and I guess it's always number one, as far as I can look back, fall protection issues have always been number one on the list. And 2019 saw a significant number of citations, over 6,000 raised. Hazard communication is always on the list somewhere, and here it's number two for 2019, with over 3,500 citations. Scaffolding, another nugget that's always in there somewhere. Number three at just under 3,000. Control of hazardous energy, what we might call lockout tagout, is there. Respiratory protection is in the mix. Ladders are always normally in the top 10 list. Powered industrial trucks, generally referred to as forklifts, are in the list year on year. Fall protection training, as opposed to fall protection training gets its own line in the top 10 list. Machine guarding, and finally to round off the top 10, PPE, personal protective equipment. When we look at that list and we remove what I would say would be more 1910 general industry citations, we can see that about 76% of OSHA's top 10 violations involve activities that are integral to the construction industry. And we can see that there's a relevance here to what we might be involved in day to day on construction sites. Fall protection is always, as I said, number one. It's still a major issue in our industry. And no matter what kind of work you're doing, there are always people out there who are trying to push the envelope and do crazy things that involve problems with fall protection. You know, and I think you can all point to examples that you've seen over the years. And there are overt examples where you look at it and you think, my God, who would do that? There's one category. But there's also a category which is a little more subtle to pick up on. And that involves being able to identify sometimes what is and what isn't a fall hazard and what needs to be done about it. So there are also more subtle issues that need to be resolved. So looking at fall protection In 2018, there were 5,250 fall deaths. Now, that's 100 deaths per week and 14 per day. That's an unbelievable number of fatalities caused by falls. And falls, quite rightly, falls into or is in OSHA's Fatal Four list. OSHA produces a Fatal Four, which are really the main focus. And falls is number one. Struck by objects is in the Fatal Four. Electrocutions makes it into the Fatal Four list. And caught in/between. And if we look at the Fatal Four fatality numbers, again, we can see that falls are far and away the majority of the Fatal Four list, 33.5%, compared to the next one on the list at 11.1. So falls are absolutely hugely significant, and OSHA pays attention to that. OSHA has just completed, again this year, its Stand Down for Fall Protection national campaign, which has been going for some years now. It's a huge issue. It's still a huge issue. It's always been a huge issue. And it's something that employers really should pay attention to, because OSHA are continually paying attention to it. There are some questions to ask when assessing fall protection and issues. I think the first thing that employers need to do, or make sure that they do, is they need to know what's in the contract requirements for fall protection. General contractors will refer to fall protection issues in the contract. And so it's incumbent on an employer to know what is going to be imposed on the job site that they intend to work on. You know, for instance, has the GC enforced additional rules that need to be taken into consideration? Do these additional rules work for the scope of work? For example, the GC might enforce a 100% tie-off issue. And that's a significant question to deal with. And we'll talk about that further on in this presentation. Another question is, have we addressed the resolution of these issues before mobilisation? In other words, do we know what we need to do, and have we facilitated for it before we step foot on the job? Also, we need to know if we have a site-specific and task-specific fall protection plan. Have we addressed all the fall protection issues on the project? And is the GC in agreement with our fall protection plan? Another really important question is, was the person who assessed the issues of fall protection qualified? And in parentheses, I've noted qualified is not competent. And that's important. Many people think that just because someone is, for instance, a foreman, then they are qualified. A qualified person is not a competent person, in as far as a competent person needs two things. A competent person needs to be qualified, and a competent person needs to have the authority to spot something that's wrong, that's unsafe, stop the job and take corrective action. So it's important, because a lot of employers make the mistake of making someone competent via the authority, forgetting that they need to prove that they're qualified to deal with the issues on the job site. And on that issue of qualified, it may be useful to bring in independent expertise at this point, if you don't feel that internally you have it, to provide an overview of the fall protection issues on the job, and maybe to write a fall protection plan in conjunction with your operational staff so that it works for everybody. So the question that follows on from that is, how we address PPE requirements in advance of mobilisation. Are we ready? Do we know? Is everything in line? Have our employees been trained on how to use the fall protection that's necessary on this job? Have our employees been trained on how to inspect the fall protection equipment we're asking them to use? Is fall protection covered in our toolbox talks? And something that's really important, have we empowered all of our employees to immediately report fall protection issues? Number 2 on our list, hazard communication, is something where there's a whole host of information available. A whole host of information available on hazard communication. We can get it from various sources. The thing about HazCom plan, hazard communication, is that it's a good thing to follow steps for a hazard communication plan. A written program is really useful, obviously. The more that can be written down, the more that can be provided to anyone who asks for information. Training on hazard communication is really important. Keeping an inventory of hazardous materials is also important. Labeling, proper labeling of hazardous materials, and obviously having copies of the data sheets, the SDSs that relate to the materials. So when it comes to a written program, a written program should cover selection, assessment of the risks posed by the material, a method of abatement that leads to sensible labeling, SDS, PPE is another aspect of this. What kind of PPE is required to handle the material, and how should it be stored? Training on this issue is also important. Work with suppliers, get external help from them, fortify the message in toolbox talks. And when it comes to the inventory, labeling is really important, and SDSs are also very important. We need to know what we're storing, how it should be stored, and what the consequences are if it's not stored properly. What do you have? How much of it do you have? Is it properly labelled and stored in the right kind of environment? Example, some materials need to be stored out of direct sunlight. They have temperature sensitivity. There are handling issues, etc. And one of the things that I'm going to refer to throughout this presentation is the amount of resources that employers can find online from OSHA. OSHA provides something called a quick card. A quick card is produced by OSHA, and a quick card is quite simply reaffirmation of existing OSHA regulations and requirements. But it's in a handy card size, front and back, two-sided card, and it can be downloaded from OSHA's website. Quick cards are established and exist for a number of issues that we're going to talk about from this list that we have of our top 10. And the more that you can get information from OSHA and download it, then that's free information. And if OSHA is providing it, then you know that it's lawful and you know that you're going to be in compliance if you follow the quick card requirements. So very important. Number 3, one of our favorites is scaffolding. And there are many examples of substandard scaffold. We kind of see them on just about every job site. But there are questions to ask in the erecting and the use of scaffold. First of all, again, do we have a site-specific and task-specific scaffold plan? Does our scaffold plan address all the fall protection issues? Have we identified in the plan any planking, open areas, tie-off points, any issues with regard to any of these areas? Is the GC in agreement with our scaffold plan? It'd be pretty useful to know that beforehand, before you turn up and the scaffold gets erected and the GC then has problems and your mobilisation plans are up in the air because the GC hasn't bought into your scaffold plan. Was the person who designed the scaffold qualified? Again, qualified, not competent. And again, it may be useful to bring in independent expertise or advice if you're not sure, or if you feel that internally you don't have qualified status to be able to put the scaffold plan together. Have you addressed ground conditions, stability, tie-in points, capacity in advance of mobilisation? Those all affect the scaffold design. Have our employees been trained on how to use the scaffold safely? Is scaffold safe use covered in our toolbox talks? Have we empowered all our employees to immediately report scaffold/fall protection issues? Is the planking in good condition and OSHA grade? Is it secure? Are overlap and support distances up to code? And then who is in charge, or who is going to be in charge of inspecting the scaffold each day before use? And is that person qualified to carry out the inspection? While we're on the subject of scaffolding, there are also on many jobs material lifting devices that will attach to the scaffold. Here is a photograph of a material lifting device on a mast climbing work platform, which OSHA determines is a supported scaffold and therefore subject to scaffold regulations. This is a hoist called an I-beam hoist. Originally, when OSHA produced its 2010 final rule on cranes and derricks in construction, they regarded this hoist as a crane because it could lift more than 2,000 pounds and it could powered lift the material and under power transfer the material horizontally into the mast climber/scaffold. But after 5 years of work from the industry to OSHA, OSHA revised that decision and excluded I-beam hoists from the cranes and derricks final rule. And that's a good thing, because in order to operate that equipment, if it had stayed under cranes and derricks, the operator would have to have been certified as a crane operator. But the crane industry, who provide operator training, didn't recognise it as a crane. So it was going to be a catch-22. But now the exclusion in 2015 gave us the opportunity then to train the operators of this piece of equipment. However, OSHA will still ask questions, and this is important for the personnel you have on the job site. They will ask a number of relevant questions, and depending on those answers, they will either be satisfied and go away and let you carry on working, or they're going to ask slightly more. And some of the questions they're going to ask is, what's the crane's capacity? What's the weight of the object you're lifting? What's the capacity of the slings you're using? And as determined by the type of hitch. In other words, if you're lifting it with a straight hitch or a choker hitch or a basket hitch, obviously the slings will have different capacity abilities. And so they want to know when this operation is going on. If you can answer those three questions, then they will probably be satisfied that you're doing things safely. And probably they're also going to ask for evidence of training on the safe use of that hoist. So just an additional note on the scaffold side. Then we come to respiratory protection, which right now obviously is something that we're all highly aware of with the advent of COVID, and latterly, or previously, sorry, the silica rule. So there are COVID requirements, silica requirements, and general requirements on respiratory protection. And there are some simple questions that one should be asking. What are the respiratory protection requirements for the task, the material, and the environment? And again, the really important question is, who in your organisation is qualified to make this determination? And remember, we also have confined space issues. For instance, if you're using gas-powered equipment in lift shafts and stairwells. And additionally, of course, that can also mean noise pollution when you take something into consideration, such as an engine working in an elevator shaft. And again, another additional note, confined space can also mean a rescue plan. And OSHA have blatantly said in the past, a rescue plan is not 911. They require you to have a written, documented rescue plan and evidence that it's covered with affected employees through the means of communication such as toolbox talk. And then we get to the subject of the masks themselves. And remember, fit testing is required for masks/respirators that are required on any or in any respiratory protection plan. Normally, it's an initial test for suitability, followed by an annual retest. OSHA says you must be fit tested before you use a respirator in the workplace, and you must be retested at least every 12 months to make sure that the respirator still fits you. You must be fit tested with the specific make, model, style, and size that you will be using. And it also says an N95 mask is only good in a silicone environment if fit tested. And here's a current job site issue that I'm getting right now from employers. They're reporting that there's confusion because obviously they're asking employees to wear COVID type protection as a general rule at the moment. But some of those people are now working in respiratory mask/respirator protection environments. So it's important at that point to remember that a COVID mask generally, as the general public would wear it, or on a construction site, does not necessarily need to be fit tested. But if you then move that employee into an area which requires respiratory protection because of its environment, then it needs to go into a fit testing. So that's just an important distinction to make. A number of employees have been caught by that. Ladders. Ladders are always in the list. Ladders will probably always be in the list, as will scaffolding. OSHA consistently issue approximately 2,000 to 3,000 citations a year for ladder misuse. And it's worth remembering, approximately 1/3 of annual fall fatalities are from 15 feet or less. And that takes us right into ladder territory. I'd like to share this picture with you. The guy in this picture is quite proud of what he's done. And when you look at it, it's a pretty ingenious way to use some ladders. And it looks like a humorous picture until you see a number of things. Obviously, he's hopelessly exposed up here. There's obviously no engineering design beyond what he's doing. It's clearly a misuse of the equipment. And also feel sorry for the poor guy who's sitting in here as the counterweight for the ladder system. Totally ingenious. Probably never see it on any other job. But again, it just highlights how some people are, this can-do attitude they have, which is, look, I solved the problem. Well, okay, you solved the problem to get you to the clock face in this photograph, but you did not prevent yourself and or other affected employees and or those who are at ground level from serious injury or fatality. And again, as I previously referred to, there is OSHA information available on the safe use of ladders. Quick card again on portable ladder safety tips. And again, as I said already, this is free. And you know, downloading this type of information, downloading these quick cards for each of your employees for the relevance of the work that they do and making sure that they've read them and understood them is great information. Not only is it great information, but you're using OSHA published material to give to and to inform your employee. Fantastic resource for an employer. As opposed to fall protection training gets its own line in our top 10 from OSHA. And that's because there are important aspects to consider when it comes to fall protection training. In order to train someone, you've got to decide what fall protection measures are required. You've got to then decide what personal fall protection equipment is to be used. And remember, we need to know that someone is qualified to make those decisions and determinations. Also remember, PFPE should then be covered in toolbox talks. Employees need to know how to inspect their PFPE. As an employer, it's a sensible thing to do to keep a written record of what you issued and to whom and why, and enforcement of rules. Now, this is a big thing. As an employer, you've probably heard that there is a defence against an OSHA citation called employee misconduct. Part of proving employee misconduct, and it may well be a valid case of employee misconduct. In other words, you've trained and trained and trained and trained a single person to the point where you can't possibly train them anymore, and they still do something that you abjectly have told them not to do a million times. What's really important at that point is that you can prove that you have enforcement of rules. In other words, you have a written plan and records that say that you have enforced the rules, that you have recognized that the rules have been broken, and that you have warned employees and reminded them that they are not doing something safely, properly, or to the rules that have been set. That record of enforcement of the rules is really important if you come up against a citation that you think is really employee misconduct. And I said I would come back to the 100% tie-off question. And the reason is because, and a couple of times now in this presentation, I've said, do you have internal people who are qualified to decide on fall protection, on PFPE, on hazardous materials and their storage and use? It's a big thing. And it's a big thing when it comes to 100% tie-off. You talk to a GC, you get on a job site and they say we have 100% tie-off. Now, the first thing that I would say about that is you've got to read your contract, because if they're asking you for 100% tie-off in the contract and you miss it, then now you're bound by it. If you see it, you need to be able to sufficiently argue your case to say it, if it is or if it isn't necessary. And let me explain that. If you're working on, let's say, a mast climbing work platform, a mast scaffold, and it's therefore a fully enclosed platform, you have three sides of OSHA compliant guardrails, and the front of the unit towards the face of the work is 14 inches or less away from the face of the work. And in masonry, the front face is generally somewhere between 4 to 6 inches only away from the face. So in that case, it's determined that you are in an enclosed platform. And if there are no other identified fall hazards, if that platform is fully enclosed and there are no drop-offs or areas of concern, then is 100% tie-off necessary? If you're backing it up with task-specific method statements, and all the paperwork ties up and all the analysis ties up, then you may want to argue with the GC that 100% tie-off is not necessary. And there may be a reason for that, and this is something that's important to remember. 100% tie-off can also potentially cause hazards. I can give you an example of a job in South Florida that I was asked to go to a number of years ago. The GC had enforced 100% tie-off on the job, and the way that they had enforced it was they had lifelines hanging from the roof, and the employees who were using rack and pinion mast climbing work platforms were using those lifelines. One of the lifelines got caught in the rack and pinion mechanism, and the machine climbed up the lifeline, the whole machine, including the chassis, including the platforms, including the people on the platform, and lifted itself about 5 or 6 feet off the ground before someone noticed. Now, they were using a platform that was fully enclosed. There were no identified fall hazards. They were in an enclosed platform with regulation guardrails, and yet the GC made them tie off. That tie off decision led to the lifeline use. The lifeline use and rack and pinion equipment is not a good mix. But the point is, if someone had been properly trained, qualified to go back to the GC and explain the fall protection risks or the absence of fall protection risks, the abatement plan, and how it was going to be successfully and adequately dealt with, then it may have been a situation where the GC would say, okay, then we believe that that's covered and you don't need to use any further protection method. So it's something to remember that decision, that discussion with the GC is really important, but before mobilisation. If you as an employer turn up on the day of mobilisation, that's not the day to find out that you have agreed to 100% tie-off, because then you're going to be on the back foot and it's going to be a long time. It'll be a torturous activity now to walk back from where you are to get to a stage where you can now provide 100% tie-off. It's not a good situation to be in. So the more that you can do on fall protection preparation, assessment, training, before you get to the job, before you finally agree on the contract, the better prepared you are going to be. And that will prevent snap decisions being taken on the job, which may or may not increase hazards. Number 7 is PPE, and I've added PFPE. Now, there's a plethora of information out there with regard to PPE and PFPE. But again, OSHA provides quick cards that you can use as the beginning of your journey to make sure that you have the right information on personal protective equipment in order to make sure that your employees are working safely. And when it comes to PPE and PFPE, something important that everybody should remember. When you issue PFPE and PPE to your employees, tell them why they are wearing it. Point out the hazards. Make sure they understand why they are wearing it. Make sure they understand what constitutes proper use. Make sure they know how to inspect their PPE and their PFPE. And it's also, again, important who decided what was appropriate for each hazard. The whole question of qualification again. I'd like to finish on this slide. I was involved in a recent lecture on liability and risk by an eminent legal group who are involved in dealing with OSHA citations almost daily on behalf of their clients. And a question was asked at the end of the presentation by one of the attendees, and it's okay, what should we do to minimize our liability as a construction company? And this is the list that they came up with. And they didn't even think about it, it just came straight off the top of the presenter's head. And they said, make sure you have a written site-specific plan. Make sure your employees have been trained in the task-specific elements of the plan. Reinforce that training and information through toolbox talks and top-up training if it's required. Be great at what you do. Skillfully execute the scope of work. Understand liability/legal issues that determine who is going to lose the argument. Embrace continuous safety management and improvement processing. And finally, have a written disciplinary record and procedure for reinforcement of safety rules. So I'd like to leave that list with you. And thank you for listening to the update on OSHA's Top 10 for 2019. Anyone who, after this presentation, who feels that they need any more help or assistance or information with regard to where they get the quick cards or further information, please feel free to email me at kevin.o'shea@hydro-mobile.com. Thank you for listening. Beth, I'll turn it back to you now.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Kevin. So if you have any questions, please locate your GoToWebinar control panel and you can submit your questions there. While I'm giving you just a second to do that, the next MCAA webinar will be Wednesday, September 23rd at 10 a.m. Central, and it will be masonry core drilling. You can go to masoncontractors.org/live to register. All right, Kevin, here's your first question. Any idea if MyOSHA, which is Michigan OSHA, top 10 list mimics OSHA's?
That's a good question. I think the answer is twofold. First of all, they will probably have their own list, as many OSHAs do. And of course, we've got, I think to date, we've got 21 state plans and the rest are federal, right? So there's a number of plans out there, individual plans. And some of them will use the federal list and some of them will use their own list. I think what I've noticed over the years is that everybody's list usually begins with falls and scaffold is in the top 4 somewhere. So even if you're going to go back to something like a MyOSHA or a DOSH or any of these lists that are produced, I'll probably bet my last dollar on the fact that falls is up there at probably number 1 and scaffolds in the top 4. But the answer is yes, the lists may well be slightly different, as will the emphasis campaigns sometimes regionally. So yeah, it's a good thing actually to go to your, if you have a state plan such as MyOSHA, it's a good thing to go to their website and to look up what their top 10 is. And as I said at the beginning of this, it's for 2 reasons. First of all, you're going to know for your own employees where to concentrate your efforts in terms of making sure they understand and that they work safely. But second, you know where the emphasis is going to be in 2020 or 2021, because wherever that list is, you know, at least the top 5 items are going to somewhere appear in an emphasis campaign. So it's going to point you in the direction of what's coming down the pipeline.
All right, Kevin, that was your only question. But
Cool.
if you all have other questions, please go ahead and send them to Kevin, or you can send them to us here at MCAA. So we'd like to end this webinar. You will find Kevin's PowerPoint as well as the whole webinar in the on-demand section of the MCAA's website later today. The MCAA would like to thank Kevin for an awesome presentation. Hope you guys have a great Monday.
Thanks.